Welcome back, and thanks again for joining us today. Up next, we have the first of 3 panel discussions scheduled during today's broadcast, and we have Chief Bob Roper back with us as our moderator for the panel.
Hello, I'm Bob Roper, Policy Advisor for the Western Fire Chiefs Association, and I'll be moderating today's panel discussion. You've heard from policymakers and some regulators earlier today, and this afternoon you'll be hearing from the utility companies regarding their efforts to address roadside and utility infrastructure ignitions. This panel will give us insight from a local, state, and federal perspective on current activities and challenges. Our panelists today, we're honored to have Director of CAL FIRE, Tom Porter, Brian Fennessy, the Fire Chief of the Orange County Fire Authority and the Chair of Fire Scope, and also the Region 5 Regional Forester, Randy Moore. Each speaker will be able to provide valuable information, and we'll do some follow-up questions at the end of each of their presentations. And then at the end, if we have time, we'll do some group questions. So let's get started. I'd like to introduce Director Tom Porter.
Well, thank you, Chief Roper, and it's great to be a part of this this conference and to be here to both present and then also answer questions. And utilities are a big part of our business now. Again, I'm Tom Porter. I am the CAL FIRE Chief, Department of Forestry and Fire Protection Director, and the State Forester for California. So what that means is I have responsibilities for all things that CAL FIRE does in the state. And I'm going to give you a little background in case you don't know, or a refresher for those who do, to kind of give you the breadth of what it is CAL FIRE does here in the state. We are the Office of the State Fire Marshal. So under the Office of State Fire Marshal, we have state fire training, code development, and a lot of prevention activities. So all those things fire marshals do on behalf of the state are under CAL FIRE. Under the prevention piece of it, and specific to a lot of what we're going to be focusing on today, are our defensible space inspection program in and around structures, as well as our home hardening and building materials certification that the department does, and land use planning. Land use planning is something that we help local government with to help kind of bring to bear the state's knowledge in this area and available to all local government throughout California. Our forestry branch of the department is really the landscape resilience place. We do a lot of landscape resilience type work ourselves, as well as grant programs that are available to you in California. They are in conjunction with our federal programs that most of the Western states and the nation has available to them as well. And we try to dovetail all those and make sure they're working together and in concert with each other. We also do timber harvest regulation and enforcement, making sure that those projects are done in a way that's environmentally appropriate, and that fuel reduction is part of that landscape level treatment that's being done in the forested environment. We're looking at landscape resiliency, and landscape resiliency is not just forests. It's all wildlands in California, whether they're under local jurisdiction, federal jurisdiction, state jurisdiction, private land outside, or in tribal as well. We want all of that landscape to be healthy and resilient to wildfire. And then, of course, our fire protection, suppression. The bread and butter that most often you see on the news in conjunction with our local government and federal mutual aid counterparts, fighting wildfires across the state. And that's an area where there's been a lot of emphasis lately. We've seen a lot of increase in costs from that in that space, costs to suppress fires. Fires keep seeming to get bigger and worse. Seasons are, we know, 75 plus days longer than they were 30 years ago. And it's a space where we can't not make investment. We have to bridge to a space where we'll be better suited to have a resilient landscape. So how does all of this really work in the utility arena? So everything that I mentioned and all that we do is looking at any fire start, any scenario that unfolds that stresses our forest and wildland environments. Could be drought, it could be wind, could be epidemic of beetles or other type of pests. Right now we're seeing a major die-off of eucalyptus and actually many species in the Bay Area. That is looking like it's just prolonged drought. But there are exotic pests that come in at times and cause forest health even in the urban or semi-urban intermix environment. And those are all things that we're dealing with. Now, utilities. What do we do with utilities? Most of my work with the utilities and with the IOUs, I am having sometimes weekly during kind of as we ramp into the peak of season. But right now, every month we're having meetings with the utilities and making sure that we're coordinated and that the utilities are doing the things that they have said they will do in their wildfire mitigation plans that are certified by the CPUC, the Public Utilities Commission, but in conjunction with CAL FIRE as one of the reviewing agencies that's looking at the validity of these plans. Most of what I'm looking at is compliance with their vegetation management and making sure that they're taking care of what they need to under poles, making sure that their corridors are properly cleared and that they're taking care of those falling hazards that could fall into lines. And that's the bulk of my regulatory responsibility. I also certify certain types of interrupters, those that are if there's a new interrupter that's produced and determined to be able to stop power without shorting and causing sparks, then I have a space there as well as a certifying agency member for that process. And so in conjunction with the vegetation management that needs to be done, I'm also very much interested in the infrastructure and the hardening of the lines themselves. One less spark means one less fire. And when we have wind events, one spark could be all it takes to have a major fire. Right now, the statistics show that electricity causes about 10% of our wildfires, about 10%. Not all of those are utilities. Many of those are private electrical systems that sometimes are put in with permits, sometimes not. Sometimes it's just somebody stretching electrical system through either extension cords or other types of non-certified for long-term use methods. So it's not always the utilities, and we need to be cognizant of that. 10% are electrical. Not all of those are utilities, but often they do happen when we have more critical weather events. And we're working diligently to hone all of the utilities' use of their public safety power shutdown mechanism, which is a last resort mechanism. We don't want the citizens or the people of California that are reliant on their electricity to have their electricity shut off unless it's absolutely necessary. And that is a key component to this. So we have to get the vegetation treatment. We have to harden the infrastructure, and that means the utilities need to do that. And then at the last possible moment, turn off the power if there's no other way to protect against that spark that might occur. So I already said that I spend a lot of time this time of year, but year round we spend time. And Office of Emergency Services Director Mark Ghilarducci and myself are part of those meetings I talked about, along with the CPUC and each one of the major utilities, and then the minor utilities as well. And I think we're making good headway. There's a lot of good work that's been done. And while I say that, I believe there is a long way to go. We need to continue to press for hardened infrastructure. We need to make sure that hardened infrastructure is not damaged by falling limbs and trees, palm fronds in some cases. But we need to ensure that the public understands that fires are going to happen in California. And just because we don't have a utility-caused fire in an area where there's a public power safety shutoff that averts that fire from happening doesn't mean that there aren't 90% of the other ways that fires can get started that might happen. So we need to continue to focus very diligently on forest and wildland and landscape level resilience, reducing the fuels in those broad areas where fire can get started, get ahead of steam, and get large and damaging, and then run into communities. So we need to do that. We need to reduce the intensity of fire out there in the landscape. We have grant programs and cooperative work with the U.S. Forest Service and other federal agencies to do that in the wildland, pure backcountry type of setting. We also need to do fuel breaks and fuel reduction project work in and around communities in that interface area where we've been focused. The governor's order, the same day that he ordered me to, or that he hired me back in January of 2019, he ordered me in 45 days to come up with things that needed to be done right now. 35 projects were identified. We did the 35 projects in the first year. We now have a continuous list and a dynamic list of 500 projects that we're continuously working on throughout the year. Those projects are primarily in that intermix space where we're trying to reduce further the intensity of fire as it enters into communities and then hits that defensible space that California and that all landowners should be looking to maintain around their homes. So the further, and then final step, harden the structures. Harden the structures against ember intrusion, reduce the intensity of fire as it enters into communities, also reduce the fires that could come out of structures into the wildland and go the other way. We're trying to look at this as a holistic, all of the above approach, something that we have done in the past, but not in a systematic and investment in all pieces of the approach at the same time. So that's really what's happening. The governor's budget is immense, pointing at $1 billion investment over the next couple of years to really put a down payment on what is going to be decades worth of dedication to this process and to this and to meet the needs of future generations. And that's what is so key to this. This is a down payment, this $1 billion. And just last week, in the middle of April, the governor signed an early action that will front load $536 million of that $1 billion into this fiscal year right now. And we have grant programs that are available and open as we speak. We have staff that's coming on to continue to increase the pace and scale of this work and the collaboration with our federal and local government partners to make it happen across the landscape of California. And truly, this is something that we, as leaders in the fire service and as leaders in land management, need to dedicate our careers to and make sure that the generations of those coming up behind us are dedicated to the same. Because there is no way we're going to get out of this in a one and done approach. Decades long it's going to take, and we need to commit to that.
Well, thank you, Chief Porter, for that insight and the overview of what CAL FIRE is doing. And I also want to thank the governor for his support, because he has set a new bar as far as funding proposals and goals for the state. And so a big kudos to go to the governor. I have one question from a registrant that asked about the CEQA process. And during the CEQA process for doing any type of fuel reduction type of work, is sometimes it can be an onerous process. And is there anything that's going to be done to streamline or to create a categorical exemption on a large scale so more fuel reduction projects can be done?
Well, that is a great question, Bob. And many of you will know that one of the things that we did after 20 years plus of working on it, we finally got through the CalVTP. CalVTP is California Vegetation Treatment Program. It's a programmatic EIR. It reduces the CEQA EIR process down to a checklist. Now, that's still quite an onerous thing for the layperson to deal with, but it has really shrunk the time and the effort that it takes to get a project, a burn or a fuels project cleared on the ground. There are a couple other things that are going on as well. There are categorical exemptions that are available for fuel reduction project work. Oftentimes they're underutilized, and we need to be looking at those, working with your CAL FIRE local units and your contract county fire departments to identify where it's appropriate to do those types of projects. And then beyond those, there's also through our stewardship agreement that was signed just last year between Governor Gavin Newsom and the Secretary of Agriculture at the federal level. We have an agreement where we can recognize NEPA as meeting CEQA. So there are oftentimes projects in and around communities that NEPA is completed for. And we have a recognition process to where we can utilize that recognition and do the project and not have to do CEQA as well. So CEQA has become less of an impediment than it was even 2 years ago, Bob.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And we may bring back some more questions when we get all done with our other speakers. So thank you.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is the Orange County Fire Authority Fire Chief, Chief Brian Fennessy, who also happens to be the chair of FireScope. Chief Fennessy.
Thank you, Chief Roper. I don't know that I'll need all 15 minutes. I do want to say, give a big shout out to Director Porter and Governor Newsom. This new budget, the augmentation funding, all that is going on at the state level is good news for us here at the local level. Before I get started, maybe a little bit about me. I got my fire service start back in 1978 with the U.S. Forest Service. I was a new member of the Oak Grove Hotshots and spent largely 13 years between the Forest Service and the Department of Interior Bureau of Land Management on hotshot crews, ultimately leaving at the superintendent level to take a job with the San Diego City Fire Department down in 1990. I did about 30 years in San Diego, left after 3 years as the fire chief in the city. And just Friday was my 3-year anniversary here in Orange County. So I've had a great opportunity to view through the lens of both a large metropolitan city fire department in chief and now through the county. And as Director Porter mentioned, through as a contract county chief. So it's been an interesting experience. I think Regional Forester Moore will appreciate this. Just the last Saturday, a couple of days ago, the Chileo Hotshots of the Angeles National Forest had a reunion. Chileo was one of the first hotshot crews, I think 1949, 1950, and so we met up at the fire station deep in the heart of the Angeles, and driving up the Angeles Crest Highway there and seeing the devastation of the last year's Bobcat fire that started in a remote area, wilderness area, not far, from Mount Wilson, and seeing the path that it cut through the forest all the way to the desert, from the urban side of the hill all the way to the desert, just a devastating fire. And to see that, this time of year, we're almost into May, and not seeing any grass on those slopes on that landscape. Some of that obviously is we haven't had the precipitation in Southern California that we'd hope to have, but the slopes are barren. They've been burnt so hotly and so badly. It's going to be interesting to see how they cover. So, get the reunion, and there's probably a few dozen folks there, and I'm probably one of the few that are still working. And large discussion took place about the recent years and fires and the utilities' role in some of these fires. And clearly, there's a lot of debate about PS, and I think we all in the fire service have had some experiences with that. No telling how many fires may have been not ignited because of them, but we had recent experience last year of actually a fire starting in an area in one of our canyon areas during PSPS. And probably the biggest effect, I believe, was, the community, of course. These canyon areas, they don't have great communications. They all, getting generators, and unfortunately, and I don't know this to be the case, but my understanding is the cause of a structure fire in one of our Santa Ana days that got into the vegetation may have been the start of that fire. So you've got the community, trying to do the best they can to prepare themselves for, a PSPS that may have led to an ignition. And then the effect on the communications. We've become so reliant on, cell phones and during, actual fire suppression operations, that when you no longer have those, not only on the fire site, but for miles around, and you're back to using radios like your primary means of communication, much like it's been up until the advent of cell phones. It was difficult. So we're seeing some very different effects, and I think probably one of the biggest effects for many of us is losing those cell towers. And my understanding is there is work taking place between the cell phone companies, the utilities, but that certainly was a hit. And talking with the folks this weekend, who can't acknowledge that we're seeing more wind-driven fires, climate change, whatever it may be. We're just seeing them. We're seeing longer fire seasons. Director Porter and I both worked down in San Diego for a lot of years, and we're coming up on a couple of years on the 20-year anniversary of the 2003 Cedar Fire, which for many, many years was the largest fire in California. I think it's been surpassed many times over now in just the last 3 or 4 years. But at the time, seeing fire spread that we'd never seen before. Chief Roper was the chief at Ventura County, and there were fires going throughout Southern California. We saw the mutual aid system impacted severely. It exposed weaknesses in the agreements we had, perhaps too many agreements. Blue Ribbon Commission was formed largely as a result of Senator Feinstein, I believe the governor at the time, and many findings and recommendations were made. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but certainly we're seeing that. I think Director Porter spoke to it very well. Man, the rates of speed now are surpassing just about anything certainly I saw in my career as a wildland firefighter, but most anybody is seeing now. You know, the expansion of residences we talked about, again last weekend. Utilities started fires are nothing new. Some of you that know fire history here in Southern California may be aware, but even the Loop Fire that killed and hurt a lot of fires back in the city, that was a utility caused fires. A lot of wooden structure, utility structure back then. That was very common. What's changed, of course, is that we've moved and we've chosen to live and chosen to build our businesses in the geography. And so that is probably the biggest reason we are seeing what we're seeing. And I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing here locally and in counties throughout the state. The mutual aid system is taxed. These fires get so large that literally, and we saw it last year, the reach out to all the states for support, international support, and the fires are still so large that we're having a tough time, getting around them all. I'm so pleased that CAL FIRE and the Forest Service are bolstering their aviation resources, their ground resources. It's not going to be over for a long time. In terms of political support and policy support, certainly the electeds are paying attention. I don't think we saw a time where there were more bills proposed, certainly through the state legislature process. I'm sure the same can be said on the federal side. We feel that we don't wait necessarily for the calls to be made by these legislative offices, but here within the county, we're talking to them all the time and sharing with them the problem and our desire for them to support what the state is doing. They are obviously a critical part of the solution. Again, the governor's budget, amazing, outstanding. The biggest piece, I think, in talking with my local government chief partners is, I believe it's over $100 million being dedicated to home hardening. And man, we love that. And I think in what we're doing here locally is we're sharing these grant opportunities. We're going to be working at establishing more fire safe councils. I come from a county south of here that had many, and in Orange County there are not many. But there are avenues to access these dollars that the state is making available. We've just got to encourage our residents and help them and partner with them to access these funds, because home hardening really is, at least speaking for the urban areas, probably the best thing that can be done right now. Public-private partnerships are increasing in the fire service. Between the state, local, and feds, there's advanced technologies that are in place and that are coming forward. But I do want to talk a little bit about some areas that we're focusing on, not just here in Orange County, but in a lot of the counties. And for us, we've got a partnership with over probably 3 dozen local municipalities, nonprofits, the utilities, you name it. It's called COAST. It's the County of Orange Area Safety Task Force. What we do is consistent with the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy. Our focus is really on ignition prevention, home hardening, and strategic fuel modification zones. For us here in Orange County, and I'd offer in the conversations I've had with LA County and others, for us, it's been more than 82% of all ignitions in Orange County start along primary roadways. We've had a focus both with our hand crews, and we're talking now with one of the local companies about perhaps there's a way to apply non-herbicides, pesticides, anything like that, but there's more we can do along our roadsides. Another 10% of our ignitions really are the result of the utility infrastructure and maintenance. I will tell you that both large utilities that provide service here in Orange County are working really hard and are really engaged in that effort. I think I can speak for those around me. 80% of the structures that burn in fires, large fires here, don't meet the current building fire codes. I will tell you, in the large fires we had this past year, the fire agencies got a lot of credit for aggressive fire suppression. The federal, state, local government agencies that support us, the thousands of firefighters that came to our need back last fall did an amazing job. But I will tell you, in those early stages when that wind-driven fire was burning into Irvine, the city of Lake Forest, we didn't lose any structures. And yes, a lot of that had to do with great, suppression action, but most of it had to do with the developers who built in those areas. They built those structures up to code. The defensible space was in place. All the things that the federal fire agencies, that the state fire agencies, CAL FIRE, the locals recommend, that was done. And as a result, we had no structure loss on a fire that, 10, 20 years ago would have likely resulted in hundreds of structures being lost. So it works. We're leveraging, that success here locally to encourage more of our communities to do exactly what, is being recommended. We talked a little bit about down here about strategic fuel modification zones around communities, largely to create that defensible space and to further increase resilience. Our approach, I think it stays this for all of local government, really has been that the impacts of wildfire and reducing this risk is everyone's problem, not just ours. And again, I applaud the utilities for assisting in ways that we wouldn't have expected not long ago. The local utility here is contributing this year nearly $18 million to bolster our aviation suppression efforts here in their service territory. Both Orange County, LA County, and Ventura County will be hosting large helitankers, Chinooks, and some command and control platform. And we'll be staffing 724 with the ability to apply retardant even at night, which is, it's not a difficult thing, but it just hasn't been done before. So again, we've got some great relationships with the utilities, and our relationships with our federal, state, and local partners has never been better. But I really appreciate the opportunity to speak, and it's just an honor to be included alongside Randy Moore and Tom Porter. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Fennessy, for those comments. One thing I wanted to ask you is that the federal government and, as we noted, Governor Newsom have really stepped up as far as their budget allocations toward addressing prevention and response. What type of actions are you seeing at the local government level? Have they bolstered as far as their steps to prevent or respond to fires?
I'm not seeing a significant increase. I'll talk about my own budget's nearly 500 million, and we don't have a lot of increases in that area other than continuing what we're doing with our vegetation management program with our hand crews, our bulldozers. We manage all of the contracts for the utilities. They provide the funding, and we go out and do the work. But I think that probably the biggest piece, and we're just beating that drum real loud on the Ready, Set, Go again. I think, it's still fresh in people's minds. I mean, we've had year after year of these fires, and we look at the number of hits we get even on our website. And we're pushing people to everybody's website. We're not even saying, hey, listen, go to the Orange County, go to the CAL FIRE, go to the Forest Service, go to Orange, go wherever you can, Google, whatever drive you have, and look at Ready, Set, Go. It is working, and we're leveraging the experiences, the positive experiences that we've had, not just locally, but statewide, where, that the program works. So again, I can't speak to what LA County and some of the others are doing in terms of increasing budget to support it, but we are certainly communicating what's available both through the federal and the state programs locally. And man, there's a lot of communities out there that with the existing non-conforming that they could use some help. They could use the roofs replaced. They could use attic vents, and we just need to communicate how that can be made available to them. So again, I can't thank Director Porter, the governor, and the Forest Service for making these opportunities available.
Okay. Well, thank you, Chief Fennessy. We'll be back in touch shortly. Next, our speaker is the Regional Forester, Randy Moore, who's has a tough job. He has all of California out of all the different regions. And so he has the California and also the Pacific Islands, correct?
That's correct, Bob.
Okay.
It includes both Hawaii and then the affiliated Pacific Islands like Guam, Palau, American Samoa, and Federated States of Micronesia, to name a few of them out there. It's an honor for me to be here to have this type of conversation, Bob, with you moderating and to be here also with Chief Porter, because I think it gives you a really good example or a kind of a cross-section view of us working together collaboratively, which I'll talk about here as I go through. So let me start by looking at more of a big picture, looking back across the Pacific Southwest. And I think my colleagues here would agree with me that 2020 taught us again that acres burns and lives lost really has precipitated an urgent need for solutions to help prevent these ignition sources that has been mentioned so far. Our wildfire situation and its impacts on lives, property, and resources continue to exceed historical years. Every year, it seems that we're exceeding historical levels. And so, when you step back and look at what's really going on across the country, historic fires not only happened in California, but they happened in other Western states as well in 2020. And when you look at all the data, on average, human-caused wildfires make up about 91% of all wildfires that occur annually in California. So enhancing and prevention and preparedness efforts are key as we look at trying to mitigate some of what's really going on here. So, and here again, just looking at some of the numbers here, over 53,000 human starts nationally, and just under 18% of those occurred in California. So the most important thing that everyone can do to help during the 2021 upcoming season is to do their part to prevent human-caused fires, which has been mentioned here by Chief Hennessy and Chief Porter. It was also mentioned that no single entity can solve the issue on their own. Collaborative efforts and shared stewardships for us, and I think for all of us, is critically important. And you may have heard about shared stewardship, but if I was to oversimplify this, it's nothing more than us working together to actively manage landscapes. And we'll continue to do that. Now, the Forest Service, particularly here in this region, we're committed. And we were so fortunate, both the chief and I, to be able to sign a sheriff's district agreement with the governor and Secretary Crowfoot. And in that agreement, we all agreed that by 2025, we're going to be treating up to 1 million acres per year annually. And so when I look at that, 500,000 for the state, 500,000 for the feds, and that's really, our goal. Now, we know and we've demonstrated that managing fuels save lives, saves property, natural resources. And in 2021, just to give you an example of trying to get to that 500,000, our intent is to treat about 238,000 acres this year, which is about 20,000 acres more than we had last year, even though last year, we had COVID-19 safety protocols that we had to put in place. And much like CAL FIRE and some of the other local fire departments, a lot of our firefighters have been pulled off. And I say that in a positive way, to provide vaccine help at some of the facilities that the governor has stood up across the state, particularly here and in Oakland, where most of ours and CAL FIRE had the opportunity to participate. So, it's hard to talk about fires and everything that's going on without talking about science, fire science, particularly, and resources. And so collaboration between state and federal agencies on issues of forest health and resiliency is critical, which was mentioned by Chief Fennessy. And just so you know, we'll continue to use science in what we do to make informed decisions and evaluate the possibilities of success. So we'll also continue to experience extreme weather events, and those extreme weather events will result in larger incidents, and they'll require more resources than ever. Now, if you look across the country here again, it's not only fires, but it's also hurricanes and floods. And so what it's telling us is that we're clearly seeing the impacts from changes in our climate. And so whether we talk about climate change or we talk about variations in climate, however you want to look at that, there are things going on in our climate. And we see this by extended drought periods, longer fire seasons, timber stands susceptible to insect infestation and mortality, and really greater rates of spread, all of which contribute to larger and more complex and costly incidents. And we're seeing that take place here. In 2020, we had about 4 million acres burned in the state, and about 2.4 of those was on National Forest managed lands. So it's really significant. And here again, we've had a number of fires that break other historical number of acres and costs. Now, this gives us another reason to expand our partnerships across boundaries and meet the annual demands for the right staffing at the right time. And so in 2021, I again foresee utilizing aggressive initial attack supported by available air tankers and helicopters whenever possible to extinguish fires quickly and minimize the need to bring in large numbers of firefighters altogether. Here again, lessons learned from last year where we had a lot of spiked out camps rather than large base camps. I think the firefighting community across the state and nationally really looked at possible new ways of how we might want to attack and suppress these large fires. There's going to be hard decisions that needs to be made on deployment of resources again this year, and prioritizing the use of local suppression resources with the predominant strategy being rapid containment. So I foresee that moving into this year. As we move into, I shouldn't say move into the fire season, because the fire season never really left, but so I'm talking about in the heart of the fire season. So creating resilient landscapes and implementing widespread forest health are essential to get ahead of this problem. And, so part of what we want to do is to seek ways to assist private landowners with managing fuels. Tom and I have had some really just brief discussions about ways to promote prescribed fire certification and training to provide safe use of fire. So we'll continue to have those discussions. Right now, they're just discussions. We need to look for ways to actually try and make that happen. And I think we're committed to that. Promote landscape scale fuels management activities that address creation and maintenance of resilient landscapes. Looking at including fuel reductions and fire risk management activities into existing and future land management programs. You know, one of the things that we saw last year, and we've been seeing this for quite a while now, is that where we have gone in and provided past fuel treatments, it's had a really positive effect on how that fire moves across the landscape and how when it hits treated area, it just lays down and behaves as it continues to move across the landscape in a much more, here again, in a much more behaved manner and not in that catastrophic nature, which we have seen so often. So we all ask ourselves this question, right? What can we consider doing differently? And I think I am proud to say this about being here in California with all the different partners here across the states, that we're looking at prioritizing investment in the use of resources. From a national perspective, this may require reallocation of resources across agencies, regions, or program areas. The second thing we want to do is accept increased short-term risk. And what I mean by this is significantly reduce fuels across broad landscape. Well, that's going to require expanded use of wildland fire. It's going to require expanded use of prescribed fire and mechanical fuels treatment in general to achieve these types of objectives. So using fire as a tool carries a lot of the inherent risk. And so, you know, we can't downplay, you know, looking at trying to get a handle on what's going on in the state and what are some of those opportunities and ideas we have. You know, so we're going to continue to work on that together collectively. And then how do we shift from a suppression posture to prevention? How do we move to a resiliency posture? And, you know, when the fire is out, we have to put it out, right? Now, put a period there. And we also have to look at how do we prevent a number of these fires from taking place? And so how do we spend time there? And it has to be a correlation between prevention of fires and also the reduction in costs for suppression fires. And I believe that we can do that as we focus on these large landscape types of treatments, because as we all know, fire, it doesn't care about jurisdictional boundaries. We shouldn't either. And so, I hopefully will continue to see that shift from suppression to prevention and resiliency in general. You know, as I looked internally at us within the Forest Service, you know, suppression costs stayed, you know, below $1 billion before the year 2000. And since 2010, wildfire suppression costs have risen above and beyond $1 billion consistently every year, with a record of more than $3 billion that was set in 2018. And as you can tell, you know, if you put $3 billion on suppression, you know, how much of that could you put on prevention and reduce the $3 billion for suppression? That's kind of where I'm going with all of this. Last year, we closed national forests in California for weeks at a time. And we recognize that forest closures are really difficult on all of us, including visitors and locals. And so these tough decisions are really balanced with the need for public safety, which minimizes life-threatening situations. And, you know, as a precursor to closing national forests, we had a glimpse of what could happen if we're not careful. And we had two incidents. One, where down in Southern California, where it was around a popular recreation site, and we had a small 10-acre fire. And as that fire was burning below the recreational facilities, it was total chaos with people trying to get out. So we need to look at ingress and egress. A lot of things came to play, and we looked at the location of our facilities, ingress, egress. Same thing happened down on a popular lake where the fire had pretty much surrounded them, and National Guard and others had to helicopter them out. We have to take a really good hard look at minimizing public safety and just not in other words, minimizing life-threatening situations. And so those were two indications that we saw last year that raised the opportunity for us to look at closing a lot of our recreation facilities, and not to mention, the number of human-caused fires. And so for a lot of different reasons, we were looking at closing a number of our facilities. And as tough as that was and is, we may have to look at doing something like that again this year if we have the same type of a fire season that we had last year. The other thing I would just mention as I close here is, what are your ideas that you would like for us to consider? This shared vision for implementing requires actions that in some ways are unique responsibilities of agencies, unique responsibilities of organizations and individuals. And so we've got to work collectively amongst ourselves to achieve these shared goals and outcomes that both Chief Porter and Chief Fennessy has mentioned prior to me. And in closing, working together is the only way and the best way to look at trying to achieve the goals that we've laid out.
Thank you, Regional Forester Moore, for that enlightenment, especially at your level, at the federal level, with all the different bureaucratic processes you have to follow. It's no easy task to say a simple thing is just close the gates to national forest lands. But that was a monumental step that I'm not sure everybody appreciated, but it helped contain our issues last year. Let me ask you, as the regional forester, you have a lot of utility lines and roads that pass through Forest Service lands, federal lands. Are there certain regulatory provisions that you can enact to deal with roadside and utility lines, specifically on federal lands?
Well, I'm pleased to say that we have a pretty good relationship with both SoCal Edison as well as PG&E as some of the major suppliers of electricity here in the state. But use permits require both the permit and easement holders to comply with local, state, and federal regulations. And so I think when you look at the regulations at those three levels, I think it's there. And utility companies have been doing a really good job of following those requirements that's listed in those regulations. I think there's always room to improve. One of the things that we've done with those major utility corridors is to, rather than us requiring them to do NEPA every time they go out and do a lot of routine maintenance, we did one large NEPA document that allows them to go out anytime they want to do routine maintenance underneath those utility lines. And so we've, much like Chief Porter was talking about with NEPA CEQA, we've also looking for ways to continue to reduce a lot of the bureaucracy and some of the requirements, regulatory requirements, by streamlining those processes. And we think that was a big deal to be able to allow them to go out and do their routine maintenance underneath those lines.
Okay, well, thank you. If I could ask our other two speakers to come back on the line. I got a couple of other questions that I'd like to ask everybody just to move forward. The first one is, with a success rate of 95% of our wildfires being contained to 10 acres or less, how best can we address the larger or more damaging 5% category? Is it possible?
Great question, Bob. I'll jump in just because I want to clarify something. 95%, 10 acres or less. That means all fires greater than 10 acres go in that 5%. And so we need to also recognize that the bulk of the 5% we're talking about are not very big fires. A few of them are getting exponentially bigger, but we're talking about all the fires that are greater than 10 acres. So 100 acres, 50 acres, 3,000 acres, those are part of that. And some of those are also damaging. But it's also important to realize that a 2-acre fire that takes out your house is the worst fire that you've ever seen. And so really one less spark, and everybody committing to what Chief Fennessy mentioned, the ready for wildfire preparation that they can do. That's absolute important. So pivoting to the bulk of your question, though, how do we reduce the effects and impacts of the largest and most damaging fires? And that is the investment that we're looking at that is needs to be enduring and decades long. And so we need to invest in prevention for those large damaging fires, because there are times when fires are going to overwhelm our resources. We need to make sure that our communities, our watersheds, our wildlife has the best chance of having a resilient status or state as fire moves through that landscape. So prevention is the answer from my perspective, Bob, and an enduring investment in prevention and all that goes along with it that we've talked about here today is absolutely important. And we also need to invest in our fire suppression capabilities right now so we can protect communities and have those communities as we move into the future in that resilient state I hope for.
Yeah, Bob, the only thing that I would add to what Chief Porter is saying is that, once we make that investment in prevention, we also need to talk about maintenance of those investments, because it's one thing to go in and treat that area. It's another thing to maintain that investment that you put into that prevention effort.
Okay.
And I'd offer, I don't really have much to add other than unfortunately, because of all the recent fire activity, we do have the public's attention. So if you want to look at the bright side of it, they're paying attention. The governor's making, FEMA's making available opportunities to do something about the prevention problem. Chief Porter and I've had this conversation a lot. You could have 100 helicopters, 1,000 helicopters out there. Once a fire escapes in one of these wind-driven events, prevention is the key. We've got to prevent those fires during that small percentage of time when we have low humidity and winds that cause the most damage. So I applaud both partners on all their efforts their agencies are doing for the local government.
Okay. My next question is that the U.S. Forest Service has the facilities and the process where it tests and certifies retardants that are dropped out of aircraft. And there's emerging technology and so forth for qualified long-term retardants. Do any of you see an opportunity to use long-term retardants to treat utility infrastructure or roadside ignitions?
So I can give you a long answer, or I can give you the short answer. And I'm going to choose to give you the short answer on this, Bob, and see what my other colleagues want to add to this. But the Forest Service policy requires the use of qualified fire chemicals at least on all National Forest Systems lands. And testing and approval of fire chemicals, that's a really stringent process that we have to go through and that they would have to go through. So, we have to be extremely careful that regulatory agency consultation is completed before any fire chemicals are tested on National Forest Systems lands. And that's going to come out of our Washington office, any kind of deviations from that. But I would say that we should look at whatever possibilities that we have to get at this issue that we're trying to mitigate.
Yeah, I appreciate everything Well, Regional Forester Moore had said, I know when, mostly, and I think Director Porter would agree with this, the retardants that we do use in our RotoWing aircraft have to be approved through Missoula and through the lab that the Forest Service manages. We have been approached by both the utility locally and through one of the large, if not the largest, retardant company based here in Southern California, and they are sharing with us that they've got some product that they believe would assist in things like preventing roadside ignitions. But I would say at the same time, anytime you talk about applying something, a chemical down here to anything, it certainly gets the environmentalists' attention, and so. We'll have to be mindful in what it is they have, whether it's gone through, the process that the regional forester has described, and see if actually the risk is worth the gain. But I applaud these companies for coming up with other avenues as opposed to just fuel removal or reduction.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would just add, Bob, that some utilities are using this type of application, this prophylactic application. I cannot do that wholesale across the state because I am applying these chemicals, applying bulldozer activities to private land that I don't own, and I don't necessarily have an agreement other than the jurisdiction of the state to put fires out on private land. So, and I'll talk for Chief Fennessy in his role as a contract county chief, and he is effectively acting on behalf of the department and the state in his state responsibility area. And so we can apply retardant when there's an emergency. And that's when we can apply retardant. To do it prophylactically, it requires a whole lot of other analysis, and we don't have that analysis done nor the agreements in place to do that yet.
Okay.
But I'll tell you, though, we should always be open to the advancements in technology.
Yes,
and
so,
we
should look.
Yeah. Perfect.
Agreed.
Okay. Well, that really concludes our time period that we have for our recording today. I wanted to thank all three of our guest speakers today for not only what you do every day in each of your jurisdictions, but what you taking the time out of your busy schedules to try to impart this valuable information to all of our viewers. I hope all of our viewers have found the information valuable, and we look forward to the rest of the webinar. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you to all the panelists for your time and valuable information today. We will be taking a 30-minute break now to give you all some time to stretch or grab something to eat. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to email them to us at info@wildfirepreventionsummit.com. We will resume today's broadcast at 1:30 p.m.